4:30 in the afternoon. The amphibious assault ship USS Baton was already making 20 knots through the narrowest section of the Strait of Hormuz. The transit plan had authorized standard navigational lighting and routine transit protocols for the afternoon crossing. Instead, the 4,000 sailors and Marines aboard were operating under a modified condition 1 readiness, running completely dark. Why had the task force commander ordered the entire formation to drop off the automatic identification system and secure all non-tactical radio traffic? A dense, low-altitude sandstorm was pushing violently off the Iranian coast, blowing directly across the transit lanes. The heavy particulate matter stained the daylight a sickly orange and dragged physical visibility down to less than 50 meters. The wind tore across the flight deck of the amphibious ship, carrying the acrid scent of desert dust mixed with the heavy exhaust of gas turbine engines. The dust layer was so heavily concentrated that the forward-looking infrared cameras and optical targeting sensors on the escorting warships were completely blinded. The optical screens on the bridge displayed nothing but a scrolling wall of gray static. At coordinates 26 degrees 30 minutes north, 56 degrees 15 minutes east, the USS Baton sat entirely vulnerable to surface threats that could not be seen. The escort ships had to collapse their standard defensive perimeter to keep the high-value asset within immediate protective range. 3,000 yards off the starboard bow, the destroyer USS McFall cut through the heavy chop. 2,000 yards off the port quarter, the cruiser USS Philippine Sea maintained station, guarding the southern flank. The task force was forced to navigate the busiest maritime choke point in the world, relying absolutely on raw radar data. The AN/SPY-1 radar panels on the destroyer and the cruiser pushed massive amounts of electromagnetic energy through the dust storm. The combat information centers deep inside the hulls of the warships were the only spaces where the crew could actually perceive the tactical environment. The tactical action officers watched the glowing green and amber symbols moving across their consoles, continuously calculating ranges and intercept angles. At exactly 4:45 in the afternoon, the surface search radar aboard the USS McFall registered a sudden anomaly. The primary operator, sitting in the blue-lit Combat Information Center, adjusted the gain controls to filter out the heavy atmospheric clutter caused by the storm. 12 miles to the north, directly inside Iranian territorial waters, a cluster of small contacts detached from the coastal shoreline. The contacts were exceptionally small, generating a radar cross-section no larger than a standard civilian fishing skiff. However, they were moving at a speed of 35 knots, punching straight through the heavy sea state and the driving wind. Fishing vessels did not operate at 35 knots in zero visibility. The contacts were operating in a loose wedge formation, maintaining a strict spacing of 500 yards between each hull. Aboard the USS McFall, the tactical action officer elevated the threat level and designated the contacts as unknown surface tracks. He ordered the bridge to alter course 3 degrees to starboard, placing the heavy bow of the destroyer exactly between the unknown contacts and the USS Baton. The cruiser USS Philippine Sea mirrored the maneuver, adjusting its speed to 22 knots to keep the defensive screen tightly closed around the amphibious ship. The surface contacts showed no signs of altering course to avoid the military formation. They were steering a direct intercept heading toward the center of the American transit corridor. The distance closed to 10 miles. The sandstorm continued to rage across the surface of the water, completely masking the approaching vessels from physical sight. If the contacts crossed the 10-mile threshold, the rules of engagement dictated immediate defensive warnings. The destroyer loaded the long-range acoustic device with the standard warning message, preparing to project the audio warnings into the howling wind, while the crew waited in absolute silence. The bridge of the destroyer USS McFall vibrated under the heavy strain of the gas turbine engines. Outside the armored glass, the environment was a total void. The sandstorm had swallowed the afternoon sun entirely, leaving only a suffocating, abrasive darkness that smelled of crushed minerals and salt. The forward-looking infrared cameras remained useless, their lenses scoured by the airborne particulate matter. The task force was entirely dependent on the AN/SPY-1 radar panels to see the threat closing rapidly from the north. At a range of 10 miles, the rules of engagement required absolute clarity. The commanding officer of the destroyer gave the order to broadcast. Mounted high on the superstructure, the long-range acoustic device unleashed a focused beam of sound directly into the howling wind. The device projected a recorded warning in Farsi and English at 150 decibels, a volume capable of causing permanent hearing damage at close range. The sheer acoustic force cut through the roaring gale, demanding the unknown vessels alter course immediately or be fired upon. Simultaneously, the bridge watch officer keyed the handset for Marine VHF Channel 16. His voice was steady, broadcast across the international distress frequency. He addressed the unknown surface tracks, identifying the American formation and ordering the approaching vessels to turn away. He repeated the coordinates, he repeated the heading. The radio channel cracked with static generated by the heavy atmospheric interference, but the transmission pushed through. There was no response. The identification friend or foe system interrogated the approaching hulls and received nothing but blank returns. Deep inside the hull, the Combat Information Center was bathed in the harsh blue light of the tactical consoles. The tactical action officer leaned over his display, watching the green symbols represent the physical reality they could not visually confirm. The unknown contacts were not deviating. In fact, at a range of 8 miles, the radar signature shifted. The cluster of small boats broke their tight wedge. They fanned out across the rough surface of the water, extending their line into a broad crescent shape designed to envelop the American formation. It was a textbook swarm tactic, executed perfectly blind. The adversary was using the same sandstorm for cover, relying on their own pre-planned coordinates or crude commercial radar to hunt the massive signature of the amphibious ship. The cruiser USS Philippine Sea adjusted her intercept vector. The cruiser pushed ahead at 24 knots, sliding into the gap between the trailing edge of the hostile crescent and the vulnerable flank of the USS Bataan. The cruiser trained her forward Mark 45 5-inch gun on the leading radar track. Without visual confirmation, the gunnery officers had to build their firing solutions entirely off the electronic returns. If the order came to fire, they would be shooting strictly at a glowing pixel on a screen. The amphibious ship USS Bataan held her course exactly down the center of the transit corridor. Turning a 40,000-ton flat-deck vessel in the narrowest part of the Strait of Hormuz was exceptionally dangerous, especially with zero visibility. The massive ship had to trust her escorts. The Marines below deck sat in the staging areas, fully geared, feeling the heavy vibration of the evasive maneuvering, but completely disconnected from the tactical picture above. At 7 miles, the automated combat systems aboard the destroyer and the cruiser began assigning threat priorities. The computers calculated the speed, the intercept angles, and the time to impact for each individual fast attack craft. The close-in weapon systems whined as they powered up, the radar-guided Gatling guns slewing blindly in the dust to track the invisible targets. The mechanical roar of the gun mounts rotating vibrated through the steel bulkheads. The radio channel remained dead. The acoustic device continued to blast its warnings into the storm. The range dropped to 6 miles. The threshold for lethal defensive action was rapidly collapsing, and the entire engagement was about to be fought in the dark. Outside the climate-controlled spaces of the destroyer USS McFall, the physical reality of the storm was punishing. Sailors assigned to the crew-served weapon stations braced against the bulkheads, their faces wrapped in heavy protective fabric. The wind was gusting to 40 knots, carrying millimeter-thick grains of sand that stripped the gray paint from the ship's superstructure. The gunners gripping the Mark 38 25mm chain guns peered into the brown wall of dust, their protective goggles scratched and coated. They knew the enemy was exactly 6 miles away, but the human eye could not penetrate the storm past the bow of their own ship. In the center of the formation, the USS Bataan initiated Condition Zebra, locking down the massive internal compartments to secure the ship's watertight integrity. Heavy steel doors slammed shut across the passageways. Dogging latches were hammered into place. Inside the well deck, the amphibious assault vehicles were strapped down with heavy chains. The crews ordered to remain inside the armored hulls. If the hull of the Bataan was breached by a lightweight anti-ship missile, the damage control teams needed the bulkheads fully sealed to prevent a cascading flood. The 4,000 personnel aboard were entirely blind to the outside world, feeling only the sharp, evasive rolls of the ship beneath them. Back inside the Combat Information Center of the destroyer, the ambient temperature was kept at a freezing 60 degrees to protect the server racks. The tactical action officer stared at the primary radar feed, watching the crescent-shaped formation of hostile fast attack craft hold its shape. The enemy was using the weather as a physical shield, confident the American warships would not fire without a visual identification. The range collapsed to 5.5 miles. The destroyer was traveling at 20 knots. The swarm was closing at 35 knots. The geometric reality of the intercept meant they had less than 4 minutes before the hostile craft entered the terminal weapon zones. The gunnery liaison officer relayed the ammunition loadout to the bridge. The forward Mark 45 5-inch gun was loaded with high-explosive, variable-time fragmentation rounds. These specialized shells were designed to detonate in the air directly above a target, showering the ocean surface with thousands of lethal tungsten fragments. It was the absolute ideal munition for destroying small, unarmored fiberglass boats. However, the gun required precise coordinates to fuse the airburst. Without the forward-looking infrared cameras to calculate the exact height of the sea state, the radar system had to estimate the wave trough altitude entirely through mathematical models. 2,000 yards to the south, the cruiser USS Philippine Sea angled her massive hull to mask the Baton. The cruiser was managing the secondary surface tracks. A new, faint radar return had materialized on the edge of the ANSPY-1 sweep, hugging the Iranian coastline behind the primary swarm. It was a larger contact, moving slower, pacing the fast attack craft from a distance of 12 miles. The combat systems officer designated the new contact as a potential missile patrol boat. The threat matrix was expanding, multiplying the variables the computers had to track through the electronic clutter of the storm. The tactical action officer on the destroyer authorized the fire control radars to paint the incoming targets. Invisible beams of concentrated electromagnetic energy locked onto the lead vessels of the swarm. In a standard engagement, illuminating a target with a fire control radar was a universally understood hostile act, triggering alarm sirens inside the enemy cockpits or bridges. But the small fiberglass skiffs likely lacked advanced radar warning receivers. They were relying entirely on speed, numbers, and the suffocating dust storm to close the distance. The American targeting computers calculated the wind shear, the atmospheric density, and the ballistic drop, waiting only for the human command to close the firing circuit. At exactly 5 miles, the commander of the task force issued the final warning. He did not use the acoustic device. He used the International Military Distress Frequency, broadcasting strictly in the blind to any command post listening on the Iranian mainland. He stated that the United States Navy would consider any vessel approaching within 4 miles as an immediate hostile threat with intent to sink an American warship. He stated that defensive fire would be authorized. The transmission ended. The radio channel reverted to the endless hiss of static interference. The glowing green symbols on the radar screen did not slow down. They held their 35-knot sprint, driving straight toward the 4-mile threshold. Inside the Combat Information Center of the destroyer USS McFall, the digital range ring on the primary tactical display flashed from amber to solid red. The 4-mile boundary had been crossed. The unknown contacts were officially inside the immediate defensive zone. Before the radar sweeps could even update the kinematic data, the acoustic arrays beneath the hull of the destroyer registered a massive change in the physical environment. The hull-mounted sonar system picked up the high-pitched, cavitating scream of multiple marine outboard engines, throttling to maximum revolutions. The sound transmitted clearly through the dense saltwater, isolated from the roaring sandstorm above. The hostile swarm was aggressively accelerating. On the glowing screens of the ANSPY-1 radar panels, the cluster of green symbols surged forward. Their speed jumped from 35 knots to 48 knots in a matter of seconds. The broad, enveloping crescent formation collapsed inward, shifting seamlessly into a tightly packed spearhead. This was not a harassment maneuver or a navigational error. It was a highly coordinated attack run, designed to overwhelm the automated defenses of a single warship by saturating one specific defensive sector with too many targets to track. The target of the spearhead was not the destroyer. The swarm was angling to slip past the armored stern of the USS McFall, driving straight for the massive 40,000-ton hull of the amphibious assault ship USS Bataan. Aboard the Bataan, the flight deck was a completely hostile environment. The blinding coastal sandstorm whipped across the 250-meter flat deck, packing abrasive dust into the engine intakes of the parked aircraft. The MH-60 Sierra helicopters were heavily chained to the deck plates, their rotors folded and secured. Launching airborne assets in zero visibility and 50-knot wind shear was a physical impossibility. The amphibious ship had to rely entirely on its own close-in weapon systems and the protective screen of the two escorting warships. Below deck, over 2,000 Marines sat in the cavernous staging areas, listening to the heavy, groaning vibration of the ship pushing through the storm. They were completely insulated from the tactical picture, aware only that condition zebra had been set, and the heavy, watertight doors were dogged down hard. The air in the troop compartments was tense and thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid and nervous sweat. They were highly trained infantrymen, trapped in the belly of a ship, waiting for an invisible enemy to strike. Back on the cruiser USS Philippine Sea, the tactical action officer watched the spearhead pivot. The cruiser was positioned 2,000 yards off the port quarter of the Bataan, giving her a clear firing lane across the wake of the amphibious ship. The combat systems officer locked the forward Mark 45 5-inch gun onto the lead track of the hostile formation. The automated Aegis combat system rapidly calculated the lead angles, adjusting the ballistic trajectory for the massive wind shear and the heavy sea state. The signature weather phenomenon dictated every tactical decision. Because the forward-looking infrared cameras were utterly useless against the scrolling wall of airborne sand, the gunnery officers could not visually confirm the size or composition of the incoming boats. They did not know if the fiberglass hulls were packed with high explosives intended for a suicide ramming or if they carried shoulder-fired anti-tank rockets. They only knew the mathematical reality: 10 unidentified vessels, moving at nearly 50 knots, ignoring all acoustic and radio warnings, and sprinting toward a heavily loaded American transport. The range dropped to 3 miles, then 2.5. The automated threat warning systems in the freezing combat information centers of all 3 American ships began to pulse with a steady, rhythmic tone. The targets were now inside the maximum effective range of the primary gun systems. The mechanical roar of the heavy deck guns rotating into position was completely swallowed by the shrieking wind of the storm outside. The sailors manning the manual 25mm chain guns on the weather decks strained against the abrasive dust, their fingers resting just outside the trigger guards, waiting for targets they would not be able to see until the final seconds. The commanding officer of the destroyer USS McFall stood gripping the heavy metal railing behind the tactical console. He had to make the ultimate decision based entirely on a glowing green display. He evaluated the intercept geometry one final time. The rules of engagement had been met. He authorized weapons free for the 5-inch battery. The engagement was no longer theoretical, and the American task force was about to open fire into a blind storm. The forward Mark 45 5-inch gun on the deck of the destroyer USS McFall engaged the approaching swarm entirely in the blind. There was no visual target, only a set of mathematical coordinates fed from the Combat Information Center directly into the automated gun mount. The heavy weapon fired, sending a 70-pound high-explosive shell tearing into the sandstorm. The physical shock of the gun firing vibrated through the steel deck plates, momentarily overpowering the roar of the wind, but the brilliant orange muzzle flash was instantly swallowed by the dense wall of airborne dust. The gun cycled continuously, firing at a sustained rate of 16 rounds per minute. 3 miles away, completely hidden within the abrasive storm, the variable time fuses detonated the shells exactly 50 feet above the churning ocean surface. Each airburst created a lethal dome of downward expanding tungsten fragments designed to shred the unarmored fiberglass hulls of the fast attack craft. Inside the freezing Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer leaned intensely over the glowing green symbols on the primary radar display. The digital representation was the only possible way to measure battle damage in the zero visibility environment. As the second and third salvos detonated, 2 of the leading contacts simply vanished from the ANSPY-1 sweep. Their radar cross-sections disintegrated, reduced to sinking debris. But the swarm did not break. The remaining 8 vessels maintained their aggressive sprint speed of 48 knots. The hull-mounted acoustic sensors beneath the destroyer registered the high-pitched whine of the marine engine's shifting pitch as the surviving boats executed a sharp, evasive split. 4 boats broke to the port side of the American formation. 4 boats broke to the starboard side. They were attempting a classic pincer movement, steering around the heavy destroyer in a desperate bid to reach the massive hull of the amphibious assault ship USS Bataan. Aboard the cruiser USS Philippine Sea, the combat systems officer reacted to the split. The cruiser was already positioned to guard the southern flank of the transit corridor. The order was given to engage the starboard element. The cruiser opened fire with her own 5-inch battery, sending a continuous stream of proximity-fused shells across the churning wake of the amphibious ship. The American task force was throwing thousands of pounds of high explosives into a weather system they could not see through, fighting a battle dictated entirely by electronic sensors. The range collapsed rapidly. 2 miles. 1.5 miles. The fast attack craft were now too close, moving too erratically among the heavy sea swells for the primary 5-inch guns to track effectively. The automated Aegis combat system seamlessly transferred target priority to the short-range defensive batteries. On the weather decks of the destroyer and the cruiser, the sailors manning the manual Mark 38 25mm chain guns strained their eyes against the suffocating dust. They were completely exposed to the 40-knot wind shear, their heavy protective gear coated in abrasive grit. They knew the hostile vessels were barely 2,000 yards away, but the physical visibility remained locked at 50 meters. The gunners gripped their firing spades, knowing they would have less than 3 seconds to acquire, track, and fire upon the targets. Once the fiberglass hulls finally broke through the gray curtain of the storm, the engagement had crossed into the terminal defense zone. The primary radar screens showed the divided hostile swarm converging precisely on the USS Bataan, and the acoustic sensors indicated the attacking boats were maneuvering into their final firing positions. Inside the Combat Information Center of the destroyer USS McFall, the tactical action officer watched the range ring drop to 1 mile. The digital numbers on the console flashed rapidly as the geometry of the battle shifted. The 4 hostile contacts on the starboard side were pushing their marine engines past safety limits, trying to slide underneath the optimal depression angle of the primary 5-inch deck gun. They were utilizing the heavy sea swells and the suffocating dust storm to mask their final sprint, intending to rake the amphibious ship with unguided munitions from extremely close range. At a range of 1,200 yards, the lead Iranian fast attack craft launched a volley of 107mm unguided rockets. The solid propellant motors ignited with a deafening screech, carving bright yellow exhaust trails through the dense, abrasive airborne sand, the sharp chemical smell of burning fuel cutting instantly through the ocean salt. The rockets slammed into the crests of the waves just 30 yards off the starboard beam of the destroyer USS McFall. The high-explosive warheads detonated instantly upon hitting the water, vaporizing the surface layer into a wall of white steam, and throwing massive, horizontal sheets of displaced saltwater violently across the armored decks of the warship. The American gunners manning the manual Mark 38 25mm chain guns flinched as the freezing water crashed down over their weapon mounts, then immediately drove their thumbs into the firing spades, sending a continuous stream of armor-piercing incendiary tracers tearing blindly back down the rocket trajectories. The heavy American rounds found the lead fiberglass hulls in the dark, shredding the unarmored skiffs into burning splinters that hissed violently as they settled into the troughs of the waves. The ocean surface became a chaotic graveyard of floating debris, illuminated only by isolated fires burning angrily in the howling wind. The 2 surviving fast attack craft on the starboard flank immediately aborted their attack run. The sheer volume of defensive fire pouring from the American destroyer was mathematically impossible to evade at such close range. The Iranian boat commanders threw their throttles into reverse, attempting to disengage and vanish back into the blinding coastal sandstorm. But the automated Aegis combat system did not allow targets to simply disappear. The AN/SPY-1 radar panels tracked the retreating contacts through the heavy atmospheric clutter, instantly recalculating the firing solutions. The radar-guided 20mm close-in weapon systems, mounted high on the superstructure of the destroyer, whined as their electric motors spun the 6 barrels to 3,000 revolutions per minute. The automated gun mounts did not need optical sensors to see through the weather front. They fired strictly on the electronic returns, sending a solid wall of dense armor-piercing rounds into the retreating boats. The glowing green symbols on the tactical display flickered once, then vanished entirely from the screen. Aboard the USS Baton, the physical shockwave of the close-quarters engagement reverberated deep into the steel hull. The Marines stationed in the lower vehicle decks felt the heavy, concussive thuds of the destroyer fighting just 2,000 yards away, but they remained locked down in condition zebra. The air conditioning systems had been secured to prevent the abrasive desert sand from destroying the internal ventilation shafts, causing the ambient temperature inside the troop compartments to climb rapidly past 90 degrees. The 4,000 personnel aboard were effectively trapped inside a 40,000-ton steel box, trusting their survival entirely to the radar operators on the escorting warships. On the port side of the formation, the cruiser USS Philippine Sea actively engaged the second half of the swarm. The remaining 4 fast attack craft had managed to close within 2,000 yards of the Baton. The cruiser maintained a precise speed of 22 knots to keep her firing lanes completely clear of the transport ship. The starboard battery of 25mm cannons barked in a steady, rhythmic cadence, sending streams of red tracers horizontally through the abrasive dust. In less than 45 seconds, the electronic sweeps confirmed the absolute destruction of the portside attackers. The immediate, close-range threat had been neutralized, but the engagement was far from over. The secondary radar track, the larger missile patrol boat lingering 12 miles away near the Iranian coast, had suddenly stopped pacing the formation. It turned its bow directly toward the American task force and began radiating a high-frequency targeting signal. The SLQ-32 electronic warfare suite aboard the USS McFall intercepted the emission instantly. The American task force had survived the swarm, but the signature weather phenomenon had hidden the primary threat until the final moment. The Iranian patrol boat was preparing to launch a guided anti-ship cruise missile, and the United States Navy warships had less than 2 minutes to establish a successful interception window. The electronic warfare suite aboard the destroyer USS McFall screamed a continuous, high-pitched warning tone through the freezing Combat Information Center. The larger Iranian patrol boat, lingering exactly 12 miles to the northeast, had locked its primary fire control radar directly onto the massive 40,000-ton hull of the amphibious assault ship USS Baton. The automated Aegis combat systems on the American destroyer reacted instantly, classifying the high-frequency emission as an imminent threat to the primary transport vessel. Deep inside the blue-lit tactical compartment, the tactical action officer shouted the specific brevity code for an incoming anti-ship weapon, officially designating the invisible electronic track as a hostile vampire. The engagement window was measured in seconds. 12 miles away, hidden entirely by the blinding coastal sandstorm, the Iranian missile patrol boat fired a Noor anti-ship cruise missile. The solid propellant booster ignited with a deafening roar, tearing a brilliant tunnel of orange fire through the abrasive dust. While the sharp chemical bite of burning propellant flooded the air, the weapon dropping immediately to wave-top height to evade radar detection. Aboard the destroyer USS McFall, the forward Mark 41 vertical launch system erupted, sending an evolved Sea Sparrow missile blasting out of its armored cell on a pillar of white-hot exhaust to obliterate the incoming threat midair, while the forward Mark 45 5-inch deck gun simultaneously drove 3 70-pound high-explosive shells directly into the Iranian patrol boat. The heavy American rounds punched straight through the thin aluminum hull of the attacking vessel, detonating deep inside the engineering spaces, crushing the main diesel engines, and completely severing the aft superstructure from the keel. The concussive blast wave threw the surviving Iranian crewmen violently off their feet, hurling them over the shattered railing and directly into the freezing, turbulent ocean swells. A column of orange fire, then white steam, erupted where the fuel cells had been, as the crushed remains of the patrol boat immediately began to sink into the heavy sea state. On the primary radar displays inside the American destroyer, The glowing green symbol representing the incoming cruise missile vanished in a cloud of descending digital static. The secondary sweep confirmed the total destruction of the patrol boat, as its radar cross-section fragmented into a dozen small, rapidly fading tracks that slipped beneath the wave troughs. The tactical action officer breathed out slowly, his eyes locked on the console, confirming that the airspace and the surface sector were clear. The primary surface threats had been eliminated, but the tactical picture remained incredibly dangerous. The signature weather phenomenon continued to howl across the Strait of Hormuz, maintaining the physical visibility at less than 50 meters. The amphibious assault ship USS Bataan was still completely blind, relying entirely on the two escorting warships to carve a safe path through the narrow, congested transit corridor. The task force commander ordered the formation to maintain a strict speed of 20 knots. They could not slow down to assess the damage or search for survivors in the water. The primary objective was the absolute protection of the 4,000 Marines and sailors aboard the high-value asset. The massive transport ship shuddered as it pushed through the heavy sea swells. Down in the cavernous well deck, the infantrymen had felt the distant, concussive thuds of the destroyer utilizing its vertical launch system, but they remained locked behind the heavy steel bulkheads in condition Zebra. The air conditioning was still secured to protect the ship's mechanical systems from the abrasive desert sand, leaving the troop compartments suffocatingly hot. The crew trusted their survival entirely to the automated sensors and the highly trained operators on the escort vessels. 2,000 yards to the south, the cruiser USS Philippine Sea maintained her defensive screen. The combat systems officer on the cruiser scanned the southern horizon with the ANSPY-1 radar panels, searching for any secondary contacts pushing off the Omani coastline. The electronic sweeps returned nothing but the heavy atmospheric clutter caused by the dense particulate matter suspended in the air. On the weather decks of the destroyer, the sailors manning the manual 25mm chain guns lowered their firing spades. They were covered head to toe in a thick layer of brown grit. The 40-knot wind shear continued to tear at their protective gear, but the immediate threat of the fast attack craft had been completely neutralized. They remained at their stations, straining their eyes into the gray void, knowing that the engagement was not officially over until the task force completely cleared the maritime chokepoint. The amphibious assault ship USS Bataan pushed heavily through the churning ocean swells, its massive 40,000-ton hull shaking under the strain of maximum continuous power. Inside the cavernous troop compartments, the ambient temperature had climbed to 95 degrees. The heavy watertight doors remained dog-down tight in condition Zebra. Over 2,000 Marines sat in the sweltering darkness, breathing recycled air that tasted of diesel exhaust and old canvas. They had felt the concussive shocks of the close-quarters engagement and the massive reverberation of the vertical launch system firing from the escorting destroyer, but they had not seen a single flash of light. They were trapped in the belly of the transport vessel, trusting the steel bulkheads around them to hold. 2,000 yards ahead, the destroyer USS McFall carved a path through the suffocating coastal sandstorm. The abrasive particulate matter continued to scour the gray paint from the forward superstructure, turning the armored glass of the bridge an opaque, scratched white. The physical visibility over the bow remained locked at an absolute maximum of 50 meters. The signature weather phenomenon had turned the engagement into a strictly electronic battle, and the human crew on the weather decks was entirely blind to the destruction they had just delivered. Deep inside the hull of the destroyer, the freezing combat information center smelled sharply of ozone, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of hot electronics. The tactical action officer stood over the primary radar console, watching the digital sweep of the ANSPY-1 panels. The glowing green symbols that had represented the hostile spearhead were entirely gone. In their place, the screens displayed a chaotic scatter of faint, fading returns. These were the shattered fiberglass hulls of the fast attack craft and the sinking wreckage of the missile patrol boat, slowly descending into the dark wave troughs. The tactical action officer keyed his microphone. His voice was steady, but the tension in the blue-lit compartment was palpable. He reported the surface tracks as clear and confirmed that the airspace was free of active targeting emissions. The task force commander, observing the data links from the bridge of the USS Bataan, received the relayed damage assessment. The American formation had expended thousands of rounds of 25mm ammunition, dozens of 5-inch high-explosive shells, and one evolved Sea Sparrow missile. In exchange, they had completely obliterated an attacking force of 10 fast attack craft and 1 guided missile patrol boat. Most importantly, the 40,000-ton high-value asset had sustained 0 battle damage. However, the digital map showed that the task force was still operating inside the narrowest and most dangerous section of the Strait of Hormuz. The engagement had lasted less than 12 minutes, but the geographical reality of the transit corridor meant they remained within the lethal range of Iranian coastal artillery batteries. On the southern flank, the cruiser USS Philippine Sea adjusted her course. The cruiser pushed closer to the amphibious ship, tightening the defensive screen to a distance of just 1,000 yards. The combat systems officer aboard the cruiser locked the forward Mark 45 5-inch gun onto the northern shoreline, ready to unleash a continuous bombardment at the first sign of an active targeting radar. The remaining scattered remnants of the hostile swarm, perhaps 2 or 3 badly damaged skiffs that had survived the initial radar-guided slaughter, were actively retreating. The electronic sweeps tracked them limping back toward the Iranian coast at a meager speed of 8 knots. The rules of engagement were strictly defensive. The American warships did not pursue the fleeing survivors into territorial waters. The primary mission was the absolute protection of the transport ship, not a retaliatory sweep of the enemy coastline. On the exterior walkways of the destroyer USS McFall, the sailors manning the manual Mark 38 25mm chain guns remained at their stations. Their heavy protective gear was completely caked in brown desert grit. The wind shear tore at their helmets, but they kept their thumbs resting lightly against the firing spades. The ocean surface around them was littered with the invisible debris of the battle, but all they could see was the endless, scrolling wall of gray storm. The task force held its course, driving straight into the howling wind at 20 knots. They had to survive another 45 minutes of zero visibility transit before the shoreline would begin to fall away, opening into the deeper, safer waters of the Gulf of Oman. 5:15 in the afternoon. The digital chart inside the freezing combat information center of the destroyer USS McFall showed the task force crossing the 26-degree, 10-minute north latitude line. They were officially pushing out of the narrowest throat of the Strait of Hormuz. The signature weather phenomenon that had defined the battle, the blinding, low-altitude sandstorm, was finally beginning to lose its abrasive density as the formation moved further from the Iranian landmass. The wind shear dropped from 40 knots down to 25 knots, and the airborne particulate matter began to settle into the ocean surface. The physical visibility over the bow slowly extended from 50 meters to nearly 400 meters. Through the clearing atmospheric dust, the massive gray silhouette of the amphibious assault ship USS Bataan finally became visible to the escorting warships. The 40,000-ton transport was completely intact, its massive flat deck rising and falling steadily with the heavy sea swells. Inside the Bataan, the task force commander ordered a partial relaxation of Condition Zebra. The heavy steel Wanhai doors on the upper decks were carefully unlatched, allowing the trapped, suffocating heat to vent out of the internal compartments. The ship's primary air conditioning systems were brought back online, the heavy filtration fans grinding loudly as they chewed through the residual desert sand in the external intake vents. Down in the cavernous staging areas, the ambient temperature began to drop rapidly from 95 degrees back down to a tolerable 75. The engineering damage control teams conducted a systematic sweep of the lower vehicle decks. They ran handheld acoustic diagnostic sensors along the interior weld seams of the hull, checking for microscopic stress fractures caused by the intense shock waves of the close-quarters artillery engagement. The structural integrity was absolute. There were no hull breaches, no internal fires, and not a single Marine or sailor among the 4,000 personnel aboard had sustained an injury. Aboard the USS McFall, the tactical action officer formally closed the primary engagement track. The automated Aegis combat system dropped its fire control locks and reverted to a standard, wide-area volumetric search pattern. The glowing green symbols on the ANSPY-1 radar panels stabilized, tracking only distant commercial freighters navigating the outbound transit lanes. The gunnery liaison officer tallied the final ammunition expenditure and reported the precise figures to the bridge. The forward Mark 45 5-inch deck gun had fired exactly 42 high-explosive variable-time shells. The two manual Mark 38 25mm chain guns had expended a combined total of 950 armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The forward Mark 41 vertical launch system had fired one Evolve Sea Sparrow missile. On the weather decks, the sailors manning the manual 25mm weapon stations were ordered to safe their weapons, mechanically locking the firing assemblies, but they were instructed to remain on watch. The heavy, ribbed gun barrels were still radiating intense heat, the expanded metal pinging sharply as it cooled against the ambient ocean air. The gunners wiped the thick layer of brown desert grit from their scratched protective goggles, finally able to see the rolling water around them. The surface of the ocean was completely empty. The shattered, burning fiberglass debris from the 10 destroyed Iranian fast attack craft and the aluminum wreckage of the missile patrol boat had already been swallowed by the heavy chop. The sea state had erased absolutely every physical trace of the overwhelming violence that had occurred just 20 minutes prior. 2,000 yards to the south, the cruiser USS Philippine Sea maintained her 22-knot patrol speed. The combat systems officer secured the firing solution that had been locked on to the northern shoreline. The electronic warfare suite swept the entire electromagnetic spectrum, listening aggressively for any sign of a retaliatory coastal missile battery powering up. The sensors detected nothing. The spectrum contained only standard commercial, very high-frequency radio traffic and the faint, distant sweep of a civilian air traffic control radar located in Bandar Abbas. The Iranian military command had chosen not to escalate the engagement. The destruction of their coordinated ambush had been absolute, and they were clearly unwilling to sacrifice heavier, land-based coastal assets against 3 fully operational United States Navy warships that had just demonstrated complete tactical dominance in a zero-visibility environment. The task force maintained its tight, interlocking defensive screen. The navigation officers on the bridge of the destroyer plotted the new course, adjusting the formation heading to 130 degrees. The deep, open waters of the Gulf of Oman lay directly ahead. 6:15 in the evening, the transition was complete. The abrasive, suffocating sandstorm that had blinded the task force for the last 3 hours was now a solid gray wall receding on the northwestern horizon. The American warships had pushed entirely through the Strait of Hormuz and crossed into the deep, open waters of the Gulf of Oman. The wind shear dropped from 40 knots down to a gentle 10-knot breeze. The heavy, confused sea swells flattened into long, rolling waves that caught the orange light of the setting sun. The physical visibility over the bow of the destroyer USS McFall extended seamlessly to the horizon. In the center of the formation, the 40,000-ton amphibious assault ship USS Bataan adjusted her course to 130 degrees. The massive transport vessel had survived the gauntlet completely untouched. The task force commander officially secured from Condition Zebra. Deep inside the hull, the heavy steel watertight doors were undogged and thrown open. Over 2,000 Marines, soaked in sweat from the sweltering heat of the locked vehicle compartments, finally felt the cool rush of the restored air conditioning. The tension that had gripped the troop bays during the close-quarters artillery duel evaporated as the internal intercom system announced that the transit was complete and the immediate threat had been eliminated. 2 miles off the starboard bow, the destroyer USS McFall reduced her speed to a cruising 15 knots. The engineering plant shifted from maximum continuous power back to standard cruising configuration, reducing the heavy vibration that had rattled the armored bridge for the duration of the engagement. The sailors, manning the manual 25mm chain guns, were officially relieved of their posts. They climbed down from the exterior weapon stations, their heavy protective gear coated in a thick, baked-on crust of desert sand and ocean salt. The ribbed gun barrels of their weapons were finally cool to the touch. On the southern flank, the cruiser USS Philippine Sea widened the defensive perimeter, sliding out to a distance of 5 miles from the amphibious ship. The AN/SPY-1 radar panels on the cruiser swept the expanded horizon. Without the dense particulate matter of the coastal sandstorm to scatter the electromagnetic energy, the combat systems operated with perfect clarity. The digital displays inside the freezing combat information center showed nothing but open ocean and standard commercial shipping lanes. The tactical action officer logged the final electronic warfare sweep. The Iranian coastal batteries remained silent, their targeting radars powered down. The ambush had been utterly destroyed, and the adversary had chosen to let the American task force sail away rather than face another synchronized bombardment. The damage control teams aboard all three vessels completed their final diagnostic sweeps. The structural integrity of the hulls, the condition of the vertical launch system cells, and the mechanical alignment of the primary 5-inch deck guns were all verified as fully operational. The task force possessed the exact same defensive capability it had held before the engagement began, minus the expended ordnance. The magazines below deck were still holding hundreds of surface-to-air interceptors and thousands of armor-piercing artillery rounds. The military supply chain would replenish the expended ammunition within 4 days at a secure port facility in Oman. The task force commander stood on the bridge of the USS Bataan, watching the two escorting warships bracket his vessel in the dying light. He authorized the communications officers to drop the strict emissions control protocols. The high-frequency radio arrays powered up, reaching across the Arabian Sea to connect directly with the 5th Fleet Command headquarters in Bahrain. The situation report was transmitted in pure data, taking less than 2 seconds to burst broadcast. The message was absolute and lacking any ambiguity. The transit of the Strait of Hormuz was complete. An attacking force of 10 fast attack craft and 1 guided missile patrol boat had been engaged and destroyed in a zero-visibility environment using exclusively radar-guided munitions. American ammunition expenditures were recorded. American casualties were 0. The amphibious assault ship USS Bataan had sustained 0 damage and was continuing on its scheduled deployment into the Arabian Sea. The objective was entirely secured, the surface threat was neutralized, and the crews of the United States Navy Task Force were officially standing down.